Hi, this is Calandra. In this video, we'll cover solving quadratic equations by completing the square. So recall that a quadratic equation is any equation that can be written in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equal to 0, where a, b, and c are real numbers. There are three ways that we can solve a quadratic equation: by factoring, by the square root property, and by the quadratic formula. What we're going to learn today is how to get a quadratic equation in a form so that you can use the square root property. And this method that we're going to do, or that we're going to follow, is called completing the square. So again, the purpose of completing the square is to get a quadratic equation in a format so that you can use the square root property to solve it. So recall that the square root property says that if you have something squared equal to a value, then that means that the something is equal to plus or minus the square root of whatever's on the other side of the equation. So notice with our examples, we can't use the square root property because we don't have a single quantity squared on one side of the equation. That's when this completing the square method comes into play. So as we go through the steps, I'm going to apply it to our first example, A. So our first step is to move the constant to the other side of the equation. So that means we want to subtract 10 from both sides. So I have 2x squared minus 8x is equal to a negative 10. Step 2, divide both sides of the equation by the coefficient of x squared. Coefficient of x squared is 2, so that means I need to divide everything by 2. And I end up with x squared minus 4x, leave a little space, is equal to negative 5. Step 3, multiply the coefficient of x by 1/2. Okay, so negative 4 times 1/2 is negative 2. It's just saying that we're taking half of negative 4, which is negative 2. Step 4, we want to square this number, and we're going to add it to both sides of the equation. Negative 2 squared is equal to 4, so I need to add that number to both sides of the equation. Now, if we did this correctly, we should be able to factor our quadratic expression into a quantity squared. And I give you a little hint for when you have some more complicated problems. The algebraic expression will factor into x plus the number from step 3. So our number from step 3 was negative 2. So we don't need to write plus a negative, we can just write minus 2. All right, so x squared minus 4x plus 4 factors into this quantity. On the right side, we just add our values together to get negative 1. And now we can apply the square root property. So on my left, I end up with just x minus 2 is equal to plus or minus the square root of negative 1. The square root of negative 1 is exactly what I is equal to. So we have plus or minus I on the right side of our equation. Our last step is to add 2 to both sides, and we get x equals 2 plus or minus I. And that's our final answer. Okay, so those are our steps for completing the square. Now I include a note in the box that you should never use this method unless it's asked. It's a long method, and there are quicker ways to solve a quadratic equation than by completing the square. Okay, on a multiple choice test, no one's going to know the method that you use, so even if something says solve by completing the square, you can use any of the other methods that you will be learning about to solve a quadratic equation. Okay, in our next example, again, we're going to solve this, give you practice with completing the square. So my first step is to move the constant to the other side of the equation. So we have x squared plus x is equal to negative 3. Well, actually we're adding 3 to both sides, so it's equal to a positive 3. Step 2, divide both sides of the equation by the coefficient of x squared. There is no coefficient, it's just 1, so we don't need to do anything with step 2. Step 3, multiply the coefficient of x by 1/2. Well, the coefficient of x is 1, so that means we're doing 1 times 1/2, which is 1/2. Step 4, square the number from step 3 and add it to both sides of the equation. So 1/2 squared is equal to 1/4. So I need to add 1/4 to both sides of the equation. Okay, so you have your calculators. Don't hesitate to use the fraction capability so that the fractions don't throw you. Next, we should be able to factor if we completed the square properly. And this is where my hint, I'm sure, will come in handy so you don't have to deal with factoring and fractions. So the number that you got when you took half of the coefficient of x, which was 1/2, that's going to be the number that goes in your parentheses. So this will factor into x plus 1/2 squared. On the right, 3 plus 1/4 gives us 13/4. So now we're actually ready to use the square root property. So I can get rid of my square on the left, and that will equal plus or minus the square root of 13/4. Well, my last step is going to be to subtract over the 1/2. So x is equal to negative 1/2 plus or minus. Well, when you have the square root of a fraction, that's the same as taking the square root of the top divided by the square root of the bottom. But notice the square root of the bottom is just 2. So we have negative 1/2 plus or minus the square root of 13 over 2. Well, since we have a common denominator, we can just combine the numerators. Negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 13 all divided by 2. And that would be our final answer. So again, do not use the completing the square method unless you're asked, because it's the longest process for solving a quadratic equation.